When my wife, Lydia, first started working with her producer, James, I wasn't worried. Lydia had been a singer for years, working small gigs, never quite breaking through to the level she dreamed of. James was supposed to be her ticket to the big time, a seasoned producer with a knack for spotting talent and elevating it. He was polished, always wearing a sharp suit, and his confidence was infectious. Lydia started spending more time in the studio with him, late nights that extended into early mornings. I was proud of her, excited even thinking this was her moment. I remember one Friday evening when Lydia came home, humming a new tune she was working on. She looked radiant, her energy was contagious, and she couldn't stop talking about how amazing James was in the studio. "He really gets my vision, you know," she said, her eyes lighting up. I smiled, happy that she was happy. But there was something in the way she spoke about him that nagged at me, a hint of something more than just professional admiration. I pushed the thought away, telling myself not to be paranoid. I trusted Lydia. We had been together for 10 years, after all. The following week, she had a big showcase coming up, a chance to perform some of her new songs in front of industry bigwigs. I offered to go with her, be there for support, but she insisted it was just another small step, and that I didn't need to come. That night, instead of heading to the showcase, I found myself wandering around the house, feeling more restless than usual. I grabbed a beer, flipped on the TV, but nothing could hold my attention. The house felt emptier than it should have. Even our cat, Whiskers, seemed to sense something was off, pacing around the living room before settling on my lap. It was around midnight when Lydia came home. She was buzzing with excitement, telling me about how well the showcase went. "James says it's only a matter of time before we get picked up by a label," she said, her cheeks flushed, eyes sparkling. I congratulated her, feeling that usual swell of pride, but as she talked, something in her tone made me uneasy. When she finally went to bed, I stayed up a little longer, finishing my beer and staring at the darkened TV screen. The thought of her and James in the studio alone, late into the night, kept gnawing at me. The next day I decided to surprise her at the studio, bring her lunch, maybe catch a bit of her in action. I figured it would ease my mind, seeing them working together, focusing on music. But when I arrived, the receptionist looked a bit taken aback. "Lydia's in with James right now," she said, hesitating as if I shouldn't interrupt them. I shrugged it off and made my way to the recording room. As I got closer, I heard Lydia's laugh, a sound I hadn't heard in a while. It wasn't her usual laugh either, it was softer, almost flirty. I paused at the door, listening to the conversation that followed. James was saying something about her voice, how it was unlike anything he'd ever worked with. Lydia giggled, then there was silence, an unnerving silence that stretched on too long. I almost knocked, but something held me back. I couldn't put my finger on it, but I felt like an intruder, as if I had walked into a room where I didn't belong. I backed away, deciding not to confront them. I left the lunch on a nearby table and headed out. The entire drive home, my mind was racing, trying to rationalize what I had just heard. Maybe it was nothing, just a professional moment that sounded more intimate than it was. Or maybe I was overthinking things, letting my imagination run wild because I was feeling insecure about her success. After all, this was her dream and I had no right to be jealous. Later that evening, Lydia came home and I casually mentioned dropping by the studio. She froze for a split second before recovering with a bright smile. "You should have knocked, we were just going over some new tracks. James is a perfectionist, you know." There was nothing in her tone to suggest guilt, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. We spent the rest of the evening watching a movie, but I barely paid attention. My thoughts were a tangled mess, trying to figure out if I was just being paranoid or if there was something more between them. Days turned into weeks, and Lydia's time at the studio increased. She started coming home later, claiming they were perfecting the final mixes before sending them off to potential labels. She was more distant, always tired, and when we did talk, it was mostly about her music or James' latest ideas. Our conversations felt forced, like we were going through the motions. The more I tried to connect with her, the more she seemed to slip away. One evening I decided to surprise her again, but this time with a plan. I arranged to have dinner waiting when she got home, her favorite spaghetti carbonara with a bottle of wine we had been saving for a special occasion. I was determined to rekindle whatever had been lost between us. When she finally walked through the door, I noticed she was wearing a new dress, something I hadn't seen before. "Nice dress," I commented, trying to sound casual. "Oh, this? James bought it for me. He thought it would look great for the photo shoot we're planning." A chill ran down my spine, but I forced a smile. "That's nice of him," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. We sat down to eat, but the meal was filled with awkward silences. Lydia picked at her food, more interested in her phone than in talking to me. Eventually, she excused herself, saying she needed to rest. As I cleared the table, I found myself staring at the empty wine glasses, the untouched meal, and I couldn't help but feel like I was losing her, losing us. Later that night, I woke up to find her side of the bed empty. I found her in the living room, phone in hand, smiling at something on the screen. She didn't notice me at first, so I stood there just watching her. When she finally looked up, she jumped, dropping her phone. "You scared me," she laughed nervously, but I wasn't in the mood for jokes. "Who were you talking to?" I asked, my voice betraying the calm I was trying to maintain. She hesitated for a fraction of a second before answering, "Just James. We were going over some last-minute details for the shoot tomorrow." That was the moment it all clicked: the late nights, the new dress, the way she talked about him. It wasn't just work. There was something more between them, something I had been blind to for too long. But instead of confronting her right then and there, I nodded, pretending to believe her. I couldn't deal with it at that moment. I needed time to think, to figure out what to do next. So I turned and went back to bed, but sleep didn't come. The next morning I woke up with a pit in my stomach, the events of the previous night replaying in my mind like a broken record. Lydia was still asleep, curled up on her side of the bed, looking peaceful. I watched her for a moment, wondering how things had gotten to this point. I wanted to shake her awake and demand answers, but I knew it wouldn't get me anywhere. Instead, I slipped out of bed and headed to the kitchen. The sunlight streamed through the windows, casting a warm glow over the kitchen as I made coffee. I tried to focus on the simple act of brewing a pot, letting the familiar routine calm my nerves, but my thoughts kept drifting back to Lydia and James. I couldn't shake the image of them together, her laughing at something he said, the way she used to laugh with me. It felt like a knife twisting in my gut. As I sipped my coffee, I tried to come up with a plan. Confronting her last night would have been a mistake. I needed proof, something concrete that would force her to admit what was going on. My mind was racing, trying to think of a way to confirm my suspicions without tipping her off. Maybe I could go through her phone, check her messages, but that felt too invasive. Then again, what was left to protect if she was already seeing someone else behind my back? I was still lost in thought when Lydia walked into the kitchen, yawning and stretching. "Morning," she said, her voice still heavy with sleep. She poured herself a cup of coffee and leaned against the counter, her back to me. I watched her carefully, looking for any signs of guilt, but she seemed perfectly at ease, like everything was normal. "Morning," I replied, forcing a smile. "What's the plan for today?" She took a sip of her coffee, thinking it over. "James wants to go over some new tracks this afternoon, so I'll be at the studio most of the day. We're getting really close, Bob. I can feel it. This could be the breakthrough we've been waiting for." There it was again, the mention of James, the excitement in her voice when she talked about him. I nodded, trying to keep my expression neutral. "That's great, Lydia. I'm really happy for you." She smiled at me, and for a moment it was like nothing had changed. But I couldn't ignore the growing distance between us, the way she seemed more and more disconnected from our life together. I decided to play it cool, act like everything was fine, but I knew I had to do something soon. After she left for the studio, I went about my day, trying to keep myself busy. I mowed the lawn, cleaned out the garage, anything to keep my mind off Lydia and James. But no matter what I did, the nagging doubt wouldn't leave me. Every time I thought about them together, I felt sick to my stomach. I was so distracted that I didn't even notice when our neighbor, Mrs. Jensen, waved at me from across the street. It wasn't until she called my name that I snapped out of it. "Bob, everything okay?" she asked, her brow furrowed in concern. I forced a smile, trying to sound casual. "Yeah, just a lot on my mind, I guess." She nodded, still looking worried. "If you ever need to talk, you know where to find me." "Thanks, Mrs. Jensen," I said, giving her a small wave before heading back inside. As I closed the door, I felt a wave of guilt wash over me. I knew I wasn't being honest with anyone, not even myself. I needed to confront Lydia, but I wasn't ready yet. I needed more time. That evening, Lydia came home later than usual. She was beaming, full of excitement about the work she and James had done that day. "You should have seen us today, Bob. We were on fire. James thinks we're ready to start pitching to labels next week." "That's amazing," I said, trying to muster some enthusiasm, but all I could think about was what might be happening between them when they weren't working. I hated feeling this way, so suspicious and paranoid, but I couldn't help it. We sat down for dinner, but the conversation was stilted. Lydia kept checking her phone, texting someone between bites of food. I wanted to ask who she was talking to, but I didn't want to start a fight. Instead, I pretended not to notice, focusing on my meal and trying to keep the mood light. But the tension was palpable, like a storm cloud hanging over us, ready to burst at any moment. After dinner, Lydia went to take a shower, leaving her phone on the kitchen counter. I stared at it, my heart pounding. This was my chance. I could look through her messages, find out if she was really cheating on me with James. My hands were shaking as I reached for the phone, but just as I was about to unlock it, I heard the shower turn off. Panicked, I put the phone back down and retreated to the living room, my heart racing. Lydia came out of the bathroom a few minutes later, her hair wrapped in a towel. She smiled at me, oblivious to the storm brewing inside my head. I'm going to head to bed early tonight. Tomorrow's going to be another long day at the studio. I nodded, forcing a smile. Good night, Lydia. Good night, Bob, she said, leaning down to kiss me on the cheek before heading to the bedroom. I sat there for a long time after she left, staring at the darkened TV screen, my mind racing. I knew I couldn't keep going like this, pretending everything was fine when it clearly wasn't. But I wasn't ready to confront her yet, not without proof. The next day, I decided to take matters into my own hands. I called up an old friend of mine, Ben, who worked as a private investigator. We hadn't talked in years, but I knew he was good at what he did. If anyone could find out the truth, it was him. I explained the situation to him, trying to keep my voice steady as I laid out my suspicions. Are you sure about this? Ben asked, his tone serious. Once you start down this road, there's no turning back. I'm sure, I said, my voice firm. I need to know the truth. All right, he said. I'll start looking into it. I'll be in touch. After I hung up, I felt a strange sense of relief. It was out of my hands now. All I had to do was wait for Ben to do his job. But as the days went by, the tension in our house grew thicker. Lydia was more distant than ever, and I could feel her slipping away from me, one small lie at a time. Finally, a week later, Ben called me back. The moment I heard his voice, I knew something was wrong. Bob, I found something, he said, his tone grim. You're not going to like it. I felt my stomach drop, but I forced myself to stay calm. What did you find? I followed them after the studio one night, he said, his voice low. They went to a hotel, Bob. They didn't leave until the next morning. I felt like the ground had been pulled out from under me. My worst fears had been confirmed. Lydia was cheating on me with James, just like I had suspected. I thanked Ben, my voice shaking, and hung up. I sat there in silence, the reality of the situation crashing down on me. I knew I had to confront Lydia, but I had no idea how I was going to do it. That night, when Lydia came home, I was waiting for her in the living room. I watched as she kicked off her shoes and hung up her coat, her usual bright smile in place. But as soon as she saw the look on my face, her smile faltered. Bob, what's wrong? She asked, her voice trembling slightly. I took a deep breath, trying to steady myself. I know, Lydia. I know about you and James. Her face went pale, and for a moment she looked like she might collapse. But then she straightened up, her expression hardening. Bob, I was not. Don't, I interrupted, my voice cold. Don't try to lie to me. I have proof. She stared at me, her eyes wide with fear, but she didn't say anything. The silence between us was suffocating, and I felt like I couldn't breathe. I had imagined this moment 1,000 times, but now that it was happening, I didn't know what to say. Finally, Lydia broke the silence. Bob, I'm so sorry. I never wanted to hurt you. But you did, I said, my voice breaking. You did, Lydia. She looked away, tears streaming down her face. It just happened, Bob. I didn't plan it. I didn't mean for it to go this far. I felt like I was drowning, the weight of her betrayal pulling me under. How long, Lydia? How long has this been going on? A few months, she whispered, her voice barely audible. I felt like I had been punched in the gut. Months. She had been lying to me for months. I stood up, unable to sit still any longer. I needed to get out of there, away from her, away from the pain. I need some time to think, I said, my voice steady. The next day, I got up with a clarity that had been missing for weeks. Lydia's betrayal had shattered me, but it also ignited something else, an urge to strike back, to reclaim some control over the mess she had made of our lives. I knew confronting her directly would only lead to more lies and excuses, and I was done listening to her stories. Instead, I decided to hit her where it would hurt the most, her career and her relationship with James. As I sat at the kitchen table, nursing a cup of coffee, I began to formulate a plan. It was time to get creative, and I knew just the people who could help. I remembered a group of Romani, often referred to as gypsies by the locals, who lived on the outskirts of town. They were known for their cunning and their ability to get things done discreetly. Years ago, I had done some work for one of their leaders, a man named Soren, when he needed help fixing up a caravan. In exchange, he had told me to call on him if I ever needed anything at all. I decided it was time to cash in that favor. I wasn't sure how much they could help, but I was willing to bet that Soren and his people could find a way to throw a wrench into Lydia's plans. After finishing my coffee, I grabbed my jacket and headed out, my mind set on what needed to be done. The drive to the edge of town was quick, but my heart pounded with anticipation. I hadn't seen Soren in years, but I hoped he still remembered me. As I pulled up to the small encampment of caravans and makeshift homes, I saw a group of men sitting around a fire talking and laughing. One of them looked up as I approached and quickly recognized me. "Bob." "Long time," my friend Soren called out, standing up and extending his hand. He was a tall man with a broad build, his dark eyes sharp and calculating. Despite the years that had passed, he hadn't changed much. "Soren, it's good to see you," I said, shaking his hand firmly. "I need your help with something." Soren's smile faded slightly as he studied my face. "You look troubled. Come, sit. Tell me what's going on." I sat down beside the fire, and Soren handed me a cup of tea. The warmth was comforting, but my mind was still racing. I took a deep breath and began to explain the situation: Lydia's affair with her producer, the way she had been stringing me along, and how I wanted to ruin whatever they had together. Soren listened intently, his expression unreadable. When I finished, Soren leaned back and stroked his chin thoughtfully. "I see. You want to destroy her career and her relationship with this man. That's no small task, but I think we can help." "How?" I asked, leaning forward eagerly. Soren's eyes gleamed with a mixture of amusement and intrigue. "There are ways to make people's lives very difficult, my friend. We have connections, people who owe us favors just like you do. This producer James, you said, he likely has secrets of his own. Everyone does. We'll find out what they are, and we'll use them to our advantage." I nodded, feeling a surge of hope. "What do you need from me?" "Leave that to us," Soren said, waving a hand dismissively. "But there is one thing you must do. You need to play the role of the supportive husband, at least for now. Act like you're trying to make things work, that you're willing to forgive her. This will buy us time to dig up what we need." The idea of pretending everything was fine made my skin crawl, but I knew Soren was right. If I suddenly turned cold or distant, Lydia might suspect something. I had to keep her in the dark until we were ready to strike. "Okay," I agreed, my voice steady. "I'll do whatever it takes." Soren smiled, his teeth flashing in the firelight. "Good, we'll begin right away. Give us a few days and we'll have something for you." I thanked Soren and left the camp, feeling a strange mix of anticipation and dread. The drive home felt longer than usual, my mind racing with thoughts of what was to come. By the time I pulled into the driveway, I had steeled myself for the act one had to put on. Lydia was already home, sitting on the couch with her laptop open. She looked up when I walked in, her expression guarded. "Hey Bob, you're home early." "Yeah," I said, forcing a smile. "I was thinking maybe we could go out for dinner tonight. It's been a while since we've done that." She seemed surprised by the suggestion, her eyes searching my face for any sign of deception. "Really? That sounds nice." "Great. Let's get ready and head out," I said, trying to keep my voice light. As we got dressed and headed to a nearby restaurant, I kept up the act, chatting casually about work and making small talk. Lydia seemed to relax as the evening went on, and for a moment, I almost believed we could pretend everything was normal. But deep down, I knew this was just the calm before the storm. The next few days were a blur. I followed Soren's advice, keeping up appearances while waiting for him to deliver on his promise. Lydia continued with her studio sessions, oblivious to the plan that was slowly unfolding behind the scenes. I could tell she was suspicious at first, but as I continued to play the supportive husband, she seemed to lower her guard. Then, on the fourth day, Soren called me. His voice was calm, almost too calm. "Bob, we found something." "What is it?" I asked, my heart pounding. "There's a woman, a singer James worked with before he met Lydia. Let's just say things didn't end well for her," Soren said, his tone dark. "What happened?" I pressed. "She was very talented, just like Lydia, but when things started getting serious between them, James became possessive, controlling. He pushed her too hard, and eventually she couldn't take it anymore. She had a breakdown, and her career never recovered. James moved on to the next project, but the woman, well, she's not in a good place." I felt a chill run down my spine. "And how does this help us?" "We've already contacted her," Soren said. "She's bitter, angry, and more than willing to talk. We'll get her to go public with her story, how James destroyed her career, how he took advantage of her. It'll cause a scandal, and no one in the industry will want to work with him." Lydia will be left with nothing. I let out a slow breath, the weight of what we were about to do settling in. And Lydia. If she's smart, she'll realize James is bad news and cut ties with him. But even if she doesn't, once his reputation is ruined, he won't be able to help her anymore. Her career will stall, and she'll be left out in the cold. Let's do it, I said, my voice resolute. Consider it done, Soren replied before hanging up. The following days were a whirlwind of chaos. Soren's connections worked fast, and soon rumors about James's past began to surface in the industry. Anonymous tips were sent to various media outlets, and whispers about his abusive behavior started spreading like wildfire. Within a week, the story broke in a major music magazine and exposed on James and the woman he had destroyed. Lydia came home that evening, her face pale and her hands trembling. "Bob, did you see this?" she asked, thrusting the magazine into my hands. "They're saying horrible things about James. None of it can be true, am I right?" I pretended to skim the article, my expression carefully neutral. "It's hard to say. But if there's even a grain of truth to this, you should be careful, Lydia. You don't want to be associated with someone like that." She sank onto the couch, her eyes wide with fear. "But he's done so much for my career. I don't know what to believe." I sat down beside her, placing a comforting hand on her shoulder. "Maybe it's time to take a step back, think about what's best for you." She nodded slowly, but I could see the conflict in her eyes. She was torn between her loyalty to James and the growing realization that everything was falling apart. I knew it was only a matter of time before she made a choice. Over the next few days, the pressure continued to mount. More stories about James's past emerged, each one more damaging than the last. Industry insiders began to distance themselves from him, and his once promising career was crumbling before our eyes. Lydia became more withdrawn, spending hours in her room, staring at her phone as if waiting for it to ring. Then, one evening, she came to me, her face streaked with tears. "Bob, I don't know what to do. James hasn't called me in days. I'm scared. What if all of this is true?" I pulled her into a hug, hiding the satisfaction that welled up inside me. "You'll be okay, Lydia. Maybe it's time to focus on yourself for a while, figure out what you really want." She nodded against my chest, her tears soaking into my shirt. "I'm sorry, Bob. I've been so wrapped up in my career that I lost sight of what really matters." I held her tighter, knowing that her apology came too late. "It's okay," I lied, my voice soft. "We'll get through this together." The next day, Lydia called James, but there was no answer. She tried again and again, growing more frantic with each failed attempt. Finally, she received a brief, curt text. "It's over. Don't contact me again." She showed me the message, her hands trembling. "What am I going to do, Bob? He's gone, and so is everything I've worked for." I didn't know what to say, so I just held her, letting her cry into my shoulder. She didn't need to know that I was the one who had orchestrated her downfall, that I had been the one to push James out of her life. It was better this way, better for her to think it was all just bad luck, a cruel twist of fate. The days following Lydia's career collapse were agonizing for her. The music industry had turned its back on her, and James, the man she had risked everything for, was nowhere to be found. The phone calls, texts, and emails she sent to him went unanswered, and with each passing day she grew more desperate and panicked. Her world was closing in on her, suffocating her with the weight of her own mistakes. One night, as Lydia sat alone in the living room, staring blankly at the walls, something James had told her came to mind. In one of their more intimate conversations, he had mentioned a small hut on the outskirts of the city, not far from a Romani caravan that often camped nearby. He had described it as his sanctuary, a place where he could escape the pressures of his life and be alone. It was a place he rarely shared with anyone. With nothing left to lose, Lydia made a desperate decision. She would go to that hut, find James, and beg him to take her back. They could weather the storm together, rebuild their lives and their careers. She didn't tell me where she was going, didn't leave a note or send a message. In her heart, she knew this was her last chance, her final shot at salvaging everything she had lost. The drive out of the city was tense. The familiar urban landscape gradually gave way to quieter outskirts, where the lights of the Romani caravan flickered in the distance. She didn't stop or look around as she drove past the colorful wagons and tents, her mind focused solely on reaching James. The closer she got to the hut, the faster her heart raced with a mix of hope and dread. When she finally arrived, Lydia saw James's car parked outside the hut, and a wave of relief washed over her. He was here. She hurried to the door and knocked, her hands trembling. After a moment, the door creaked open, and there he was, James, looking disheveled and exhausted, with a hard expression she had never seen before. Lydia, he said flatly, his eyes narrowing. What are you doing here? I had to see you, she pleaded, stepping inside. I couldn't just leave things like this. We can fix this, James. We can get through it together. James didn't move, just stood there, staring at her with an icy detachment. There's nothing to fix, Lydia. It's over. You need to leave. She shook her head, tears welling up in her eyes. No, James, please, I need you. My career, everything, it's all falling apart. We can still make this work. We can start over, rebuild. James let out a bitter laugh, turning away from her to start packing up his things. You don't get it, do you? This isn't about us. It's about me. My life is ruined because of you. My secrets, my past, they've all been dragged into the light, and now I'm finished. Lydia stepped closer, reaching out to him. It wasn't me, James. I didn't do anything to hurt you. We can still make things right. He spun around, his face twisted with rage. You think this is about making things right? You think you can just walk in here and everything will be okay? You're a fool, Lydia. You've ruined me and now you expect me to save you? No. If you want to stay alive, you'll keep your mouth shut about everything. Or I'll make sure you never talk again. Lydia froze, the threat sinking in. She had never seen this side of James before, the cold, calculating darkness that lurked beneath his charm. James, that's not. Shut up, he snapped, advancing on her. You're done, Lydia. Your career, your life, everything you had is gone. And if you keep pushing, I'll make sure you disappear for good. Panic gripped her as she backed away, realizing too late the danger she was in. But just as James reached for her, the door burst open. A group of Romani men stormed in, led by Soren. They moved with calm confidence, as if they had been expecting this. Soren's eyes locked onto James with a cold, knowing glare. You won't be harming anyone tonight, Soren said, his voice steady as he signaled to the others. They moved quickly, restraining James as he struggled, his threats turning into desperate pleas. Lydia watched in shock as the scene unfolded, her mind reeling from the sudden turn of events. Soren turned to Lydia, his expression softening slightly. You're coming with us. Your husband sent us to keep you safe. Lydia was too stunned to resist as they led her out of the hut and into one of the caravans parked nearby. She sat in silence as they drove her back to our house, her thoughts a chaotic jumble of fear, confusion, and disbelief. When they arrived, Soren helped her out of the caravan and handed her over to me, who was waiting anxiously in the driveway. Lydia looked at me, her eyes wide with a mixture of anger and relief. What happened? I asked Soren, trying to make sense of everything. Soren gave me a brief, serious nod and began to explain. He told me how they had followed Lydia when she left for the hut, knowing she might be in danger. They watched from a distance as she confronted James and listened in as things escalated. When James threatened her, Soren and his men moved in, stopping him before he could do anything drastic. I listened in silence, a cold anger rising within me as Soren recounted the confrontation. Lydia's eyes widened as she realized I had been behind it all. You did this, didn't you? She spat at me, her voice trembling with rage. You set this whole thing up, you ruined my career, and now you had those people drag me back here like some criminal. I looked at her calmly, my face unreadable. Yes, I did, but I didn't ruin your career. You did that when you chose him over everything else. They didn't help me expose James, they helped keep you alive. Do you even realize what he was about to do? Her anger faltered for a moment as she took in my words. You bastard, she muttered, her voice cracking. You're the reason everything fell apart. You ruined my life. I saved your life, I corrected, my voice cold. If it weren't for them, you wouldn't be standing here right now. Soren remained silent, his gaze shifting between us, as if waiting for the next move. After a long pause, Lydia's fury gave way to exhaustion. She sank down onto the front steps, her head in her hands. The reality of the situation was finally sinking in, and she was too tired to keep fighting. What happens now? She asked, her voice barely a whisper. We file for divorce, I said simply. It's over, Lydia. There's nothing left to save. She looked up at me, her eyes hollow, and nodded slowly. Yeah, I guess you're right. Before leaving, I turned to Soren and asked the question that had been nagging at me. Where did you get these contacts in the city? I thought your people traveled from place to place. Soren's expression remained impassive as he responded, We have our ways, Bob. Our paths cross with many, and our connections run deep. That's all you need to know. He offered no further explanation, and I knew better than to press him. Instead, I thanked him and watched as he and his men left, their caravan moving off into the night. The next morning, Lydia and I met with a lawyer and began the process of ending our marriage. It was a quiet, somber affair with none of the usual shouting or accusations. We were both too drained, too broken to keep fighting. As we signed the papers, Lydia looked at me one last time. "I never thought it would end like this," she said softly. "Neither did I," replied, my tone resigned. With the final signature, our marriage was officially over. Lydia left the lawyer's office without another word, disappearing into the city streets. I watched her go, a strange sense of relief washing over me. What happened to James, whether he faced justice or simply vanished, was no longer my concern. After the divorce, Lydia went to live with her sister. We didn't speak much after that, and honestly, there wasn't much left to say. A few weeks after Lydia moved out, I decided to visit the Romani caravan one last time. I wanted to thank Soren and his people properly. When I arrived, they were packing up to leave, as they often did, moving on to wherever the road would take them next. Soren greeted me with a nod, his eyes reflecting the firelight as the last of their belongings were loaded onto the wagons. "It's good to see you again, Bob," Soren said, clasping my hand. "But I have a feeling this might be our last meeting." I nodded, glancing around at the bustling camp. "I just wanted to thank you for everything. I don't know what would have happened if you hadn't been there that night." Soren gave a slight smile. "We were just in the right place at the right time. But you should think about your own path now. We're moving south. It's getting chilly here at night. Maybe it's time for you to consider a change too." I stared at him, surprised by how his words resonated with me. "Funny you should say that. I've been thinking about moving south as well. Selling the house, buying some land, starting fresh. But I don't know. It's a big step." Soren's eyes twinkled with a knowing look. "It is. But sometimes staying in one place is the hardest thing of all. We're leaving tonight, Bob. By morning, this place will be nothing but an empty field. If you want to move, move. Don't let anything hold you back." I watched as the last of the wagons was packed, and Soren turned to lead his people out of the clearing. I stayed there for a while, lost in thought, watching the caravan disappear into the distance. When I finally headed back to my car and returned to that area later that evening, just as Soren had said, there was nothing left. No torches, no tents, no sign that they had ever been there. It was just an empty field, as if the caravan had vanished into thin air. As the months passed, I heard that James had received a criminal sentence for all his crimes. It seemed that his past had finally caught up with him, and he was paying the price. The idea of moving south began to grow on me. I wasn't tied to any place. I worked as a freelancer and could do my job from anywhere. The thought of warm weather, open land, and a fresh start became more and more appealing. So I started looking at ads and sites on the internet where I could sell my house and buy land in a southern state. It wasn't as easy as I thought it would be. Selling the house where I had lived for so many years, where I had built a life with Lydia, even if it had ended badly, wasn't a decision to take lightly. But the more I looked at plots of land in places like Texas, Georgia, and Florida, the more I realized that this was what I needed: a complete break, a new beginning. Finally, after months of searching, I found a piece of land that felt right. It was in a quiet area, with plenty of space, surrounded by nature. The price was reasonable, and I could picture myself there, building a new life from the ground up. I put my house on the market, and soon enough I had a buyer. On the day I signed the papers to sell the house, I felt a strange mix of emotions: relief, excitement, and a touch of sadness. But as I stood in the empty house, the echoes of the past fading away, I knew I had made the right choice. A week later, I packed up my car and drove south. As I drove, the air grew warmer, the landscape greener. When I finally arrived at my new piece of land, I stepped out of the car and took a deep breath, the warm breeze carrying the scent of pine and fresh earth. This was it, just like I dreamed.